So we are recording. Hi, Sabia. How's it going? How's your week?
Hi, how are you doing today? My week's been pretty good, a little busy, but all good.
Yeah, totally uneventful with no giant cultural events or shifts happening at all. Thank you for so much for joining us. This is the third installment of our Anti-Racism in Capoeira speaker series. The purpose of this series is to amplify and archive the work of amazing instructors in our community that are already doing the kind of work that we envision our community as a whole doing. So, Sabia, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you from, what you do, all of that?
Sure. I'm Instructora Sabia. I am a capoeira instructor for Capoeira Manjenga Detroit. I've been teaching capoeira for about 9 years now, training for 13. I am also a software engineer by day and a capoeirista by night. I'm originally from the South. I grew up in Louisiana, spent a small stint, 4 years of my childhood living in Germany, moved back to Louisiana, and then relocated in Michigan and spent the rest of my adult life pretty much here in Michigan.
I didn't know you lived in Germany. I feel like I'm always learning new things. Um, so this series is focusing on anti-racist capoeira teaching. So you are currently running a kids class. Can you tell me a little bit about that kids class?
Sure. So I have a kids class that is I run once a week. We have kids from age 5 all the way up to age, I think our oldest one now is just turning 13. It's going to be a teenager. The class focuses a lot on play in capoeira, but we also discuss a lot of the culture and history. The kids learn a lot of the music as well as the movement, and they learn what they're doing and why they're doing it.
And it's pretty interesting, right? Because our first speaker primarily was teaching capoeira to Black youth living in an under-resourced area, and so it's very interesting because your kids are mostly affluent and white kids, and so I imagine that the conversations that happen around the culture of capoeira are very different than if you have like a more diverse population. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of conversations around culture that you have in your classes?
Absolutely. So, my Capoeira Kids class demographic started out when we first started the class was primarily students of color, and pretty much I had all girls when we started out. And so it was a unique dynamic because we're talking about people who typically don't necessarily flock to a martial art in terms of their gender, and even more so in terms of their race. So at the beginning, when I started the capoeira class, I spent a good majority of time explaining to my kids what the history is. We talked about things like transatlantic slave trade. We talked about the different cultures, what it is like to have to assimilate into a culture, and what that really meant. Of course, these types of words are a little bit too big for kids who are age 5, 6, and 10 years old. So we had to phrase things in such a way that they can understand it. As my class continued on, the demographic has changed. We've gone from having mostly children of color who are young girls to having mostly children who are white, who come from slightly more comfortable backgrounds, we do still have some children of color that are there, but the demographic has definitely shifted. Age-wise, it's still the same. We've gone to having more boys than having more girls. So the actions that have to happen in class and the conversations that have to happen in class have to happen in a different way. With the young girls that I had in my class, the conversation was a little bit more of a dialogue. Here's the information. What do you think of this? What have you learned from this? What did you take away from this? And a lot of my young girls are, very attentive to that knowledge, and they were able to ask questions like, you know, where did the slaves come from? And having to say to them, well, these aren't people who were slaves, these were people. These are people who were stolen from their homes. These are people who were taken away from their families and their culture and their religion, and they were forced to live a life that they did not want to live, and they were forced to live that life under oppression. And explaining that connection to the people that created this martial art and then the martial art itself, I think that the kids connected to it really well. With the young boys, I think there's still a connection there. It's less of a dialogue when I talk with the young boys, just because their attention span is a little bit different, and it's a little bit more of here's the information. Do you understand it? So with that class, one of the things that I have experienced is how parents interact with their children with regard to conversations about race. One of the things I'd say I've been very fortunate about is all of my parents, regardless of their racial background or demographic or anything like that, have been incredibly supportive and appreciative of my efforts and what I do to convey the history to their children in a way that they can understand it. But it's interesting, I see anyway, it's interesting to have these different conversations and see on some of the parents a sense of relief that I'm having this conversation with them.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting when you look at this is the example in capoeira is that you can't be true to the history of capoeira without talking about really uncomfortable stuff. But that has huge transference to American history in general, like Thanksgiving, Christopher
Mm-hmm.
Columbus. Like, and I think that there's a cultural aversion in general. We don't think the kids are ready for this dialogue, and we don't think that acknowledging the harms that were committed is important to preventing them in the future. Um, and so in that way, I think that we see a lot of families that are um, just not having these conversations. Would you say that like that's about right? Like people are kind of waiting, they're waiting for that space that you've created as a Black woman to be the authority on race and race relations instead of like having them in their house. Is that like is that accurate assessment of it?
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So to touch on that a lot, one of the things that I recognize as a person of color, growing up as a person of color, and in and in my community and in my own family, is that my mom, my aunts, my family, we talked about race and race dynamics all the time. And the conversation went across the board, from reminding me that I was just as able, just as equal, just as rightfully allowed to have anything in this world that I want, compared to someone who may have been my white counterpart, to being told, when you are engaged with law enforcement, have all of your credentials, have your stuff together, have everything ready, don't mess around, eyes forward, say yes sir, all of these kinds of conversations that I recognize don't necessarily happen in homes that where there's a little bit more of privilege there. Now, what I mean to say with this is that the parents aren't necessarily racist. A lot of them are allies and are down for the cause and extraordinarily supportive, but they have a different approach when it comes to having a dialogue with their children about racism. For me, I knew what I looked like from a very young age. It was, you know, my family, the conversations I had with my mother. And then because I was a person of color, I am a person of color. Because of that, the world obviously reminded me all the time of what I looked like. I just, you can't forget. Um, so a lot of the conversations that I had growing up had to do with, we're all equal. It's okay. These are the race dynamics. You have to understand where everyone is coming from. Everybody is the same. Everyone comes to the table equally. With my parents and other people who grew up in white families or in families of privilege and things like that, those conversations don't necessarily happen. And the sense that I get, now this is just my personal experience, is that it's it's easier to not teach your children hate than it is to have a conversation that acknowledges that there are people of different races and different cultures and different religions and different backgrounds and different gender identities, and they're all still equal to you. And what I have discovered is that, at least in my capacity of my capoeira class, when I have these conversations with the children, that the parents tend to feel like, okay, the conversation has been had.
Yeah. No, and I think it's so interesting, the specific examples that you gave. I'm thinking about like how powerful it could be if we did engage white kids with these conversations. So if you're talking about, you know, you and your family talked about you're going to have to work harder, you know, because you're a woman, because you're Black. If that same conversation happened on the flip side, right, to little white kids, be like, hey, I know that you have, you know, some Black friends in your class. Here's some things that they might experience. And I think it's very interesting because I used to foster kids, and we always started talking to them very young about consent, you know, and I think people think that you have to tell them all the bad just, you know, right up front, but just the little things of like, hey, maybe notice, like, is this Black child treated differently than this white child? Why do you think that is? How do you think, you know, that might be impacting how they're interacting at school? These types of things, and kind of building that empathy. Like when I teach consent to little kids, it starts out from like very, very accessible language to them. It's like, if they're not having a good time, we stop, you know? And I could think that there's so many ways that like white children can from very young ages become accomplices to their allies, accomplices, co-conspirators. There's a lot of words for allies that get thrown around, but to their classmates, you know? And then even in the more severe instances of overt racism, like if you get pulled over, here's what you do. What if we had a world where we taught white children, hey, if a Black child is singled out, you and your high school friends are hanging out and your Black friend is singled out by the police, don't leave, report it. But like challenge that's happening if somebody's being singled out for it, you know?
Yeah, actually, I think that it's the points that you're making are very good, and the key thing that I would like to touch on is the word empathy.
Yeah.
This is, I think, the heart of a lot of our issues with race and race dynamic is the lack of empathy, the lack of understanding of someone else's experience. You know, my understanding, my, you know, personal understanding, not textbook dictionary understanding, but my understanding of the difference between sympathy and empathy is, with sympathy, you can feel for someone's experience, but with empathy, you can place yourself in that experience and understand what it means. And I think with this type of subject matter, and I think with, you know, particularly interacting with kids, is that it's easier to teach them a little bit of sympathy. You know, it's easier to teach them to feel sad that their Black friend got singled out. But it's not as easy, I think, for parents anyway, of white kids to have the conversation that actually means empathy. You know, what if someone singled you out strictly because of the way you looked and treated you differently because of the way you looked? Those are the kind of conversations that I don't believe are always happening in the home. I think the conversations are usually, you know, don't hate someone who looks different than you. And that's usually where it stops.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that parents are very keyed in to see the overt racism that might happen in like two children or in child spaces, but they don't necessarily like see the subtle stuff. And so they think if it's not blatant and they haven't taught it, that they're not still teaching by not intervening or not talking about it. You know, like teaching happens in many different ways. Silence is permissive. And when we talk about, you know, a major thing that we as white people have to work on is white silence. And that can start very, very young, with not even giving children the dialogue and the thought exercises to understand race at all. And then they turn into adults who can't have these conversations that we're trying to have. Especially in this moment. I mean, there's a lot going on right now, and
Yes, indeed.
to say the least. And we're seeing people that are like getting involved for the first time ever. We're
Yeah.
seeing people that were definitively on the wrong side of things not but a week ago that are
Hmm.
like donating to BLM. They're like posting the things on Facebook. They're
Yeah.
showing up at the protest and getting hit in the face with rubber bullets for the first time. Welcome. It really hurt. Um, and so yeah, it's so interesting that we're seeing this massive public engagement at finally, you know, something that people have been pushing for in the activist community, in the Black Lives Matter community forever, ever. But there's still this disconnect, right? Because
Hmm.
there's still people that can go out and protest and then come home and look at, well, am I going to send my kid back to this school this year? Well, I think it's gotten a little bit more diverse. And you know how those kids are,
Hmm.
those kids, you know, and there's this huge disconnect when we look at just performative allyship. So can you speak a little bit to that from your perspective?
Absolutely, absolutely. Recently, I had a conversation with a friend about this exact subject matter, and the conversation was it was very uplifting for both of us. We talked about what happens when hashtag BLM stops trending. What happens when, doing the fist ain't cool no more? What happens when the people are exhausted from going to a protest and they want to stay home that day and the numbers dwindle down? So we discussed that. We said, how many people are out there and they really mean it in their hearts? When they really mean it in their hearts, how many people are out there and how many people are out there that are just hopping on a bandwagon? Now, what's amazing about what's happening right now in 2020, so for future generations who get to watch this, this is happening right now in the summer of 2020 amidst so many other things.
Yeah.
What's amazing is that this has been one of the biggest civil rights movements worldwide in our history. It I get goosebumps when I say that because my mother who is no longer with me, protested these exact same things. She was out there as part of the crowd with Martin Luther King. She told me the story. She was a teenager when she was out there. She was a teen, but she still was out there protesting these exact things. And when we think of civil rights movement, we think of Martin Luther King. That's what we've kind of been, for lack of a better way of saying it, brainwashed. There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of civil rights activists in my mom's era, but that's the one that we're brainwashed to remember. And not to diminish any merit of Martin Luther King, but there were so many that helped this movement along. So when we talk about allies, we need to think about, and I think our allies most importantly need to think about what happens when the trend dies down. And the conversation that I had with my friend was, you know we go out to these protests and it's, I can't hide my skin color, so yes, I'm going to say Black Lives Matter because I think that my life does matter. She's going to say the same because she's also a person of color. What happens when our white allies put the signs down? Would they come up to us and strike up a conversation? Would they invite one of us, if they knew us? We don't have to be strangers in this, but if they knew us, would they feel comfortable enough to invite us to dinner? Would they feel comfortable enough to interact with us if they saw one of us walking down the street, from a grocery store or whatever, minding our own business? Would they still feel compelled to even tense up, pretend like they're on the phone, maybe cross the street? How deep does the ally actually go?
That goes a lot to like implicit bias and just the internal parts of racism, you know. And I want to clarify because I do want this lecture series to be accessible to everybody. When we talk about racism, right, we're not just talking about somebody was mean to you because of some aspect of your being. We're talking about system, like harm that's supported by like the greater system, right? So if we're talking about like a little white boy bullies a little black boy bullies a little white boy. That's not racism. It might be prejudice if he's doing it because he's white. But if it happens the other way, a little white boy bullies a little black boy, that is racism, because when we look at the larger systems that that little black boy interacts with, he might go tell the teacher who says, oh, that's a trouble. He's a troublemaker. He's aggressive. I'm going to put him, you know, in some type of disciplinary, like have him disciplined in some way. He might be exposed to all these different aspects that interact with larger systems that are harming him, you know? And so when we talk about racism, it's not just KKK and cross burning, it's picking a resume that has a name that you like, you know? It's what school do my kids go to? How proximal are, you know, how many people say I want my kid to go to a good school and they mean a white school? It's I don't want to go to that neighborhood at night because you know how those people are. So I think that, you know, can you speak a little bit more to the implicit bias and not just the overt racism that people are really rallying against right now?
Absolutely, yes. So, you know, you touched on some amazingly great points when it comes to implicit bias and internal bias. You know, the easiest way that you can check your bias, and let me start by saying this: everyone of all colors and all genders and all backgrounds have some degree of implicit bias. We all do. But it doesn't necessarily excuse it when that implicit bias, that little seed of implicit bias, of tiny racism, is what grows into these massive overt racism, you know, where we have to protest because a white police officer drops his knee on the neck of a black man for what? Counterfeit $20 bill, something, some
It's like a
nonsense like that.
check that was
Check,
supposedly forged, but also
forged check,
wasn't.
wrote a bad check. I mean, seriously. So this is, to me, this is actually really important because I feel like implicit bias and implicit racism and internal racism and things like that are what grow into what we see. If if you see me, not you, the general you, if a white person sees me walking down the street and they don't know me at all, they may assume a lot of things about black women and put that assumption onto me. They may put those things on me. They may have the stereotypical angry black woman, the stereotypical strong black woman, like, you know, like black women aren't allowed to have moments of tenderness and softness and breakdown and cry. And all the other things that fit into that category. And when they approach me, even if it's, you know, I deal with this with people who actually have to talk to me. Um, Assume that I am undereducated or uneducated altogether. Assume that I am inarticulate or that I don't have mastery of the English language, or that maybe I speak Ebonics or something like that. You know, I sound like a little black girl or whatever. And, you know, I grew up in the South. I can flip my Southern on if I need to, but I don't have to. But all of that is what happens if I enter in a situation. I'll give you an example. I recently walked into a business where I needed to conduct something that had to do with finances. And I already knew what I had to do and what I needed to explain to the financial person because I have to do this all the time. And I had to explain and re-explain and ask questions and re-ask questions because no matter what I was telling this person, they refused to listen to me because I was the black person that walked in that has no idea what I'm talking about, and they're the white person that knows what they're doing, so they don't have to hear me. And let's just say if I hadn't stuck with it and asked the questions that I had asked, I likely would have lost some money. So, and that ain't okay, you know, don't mess with my money. But my point is, there was that implicit bias that, you know, because the place that I was in is in a particular neighborhood that had more people of color. That, you know, I'm a dark skinned black woman that's walking in, so therefore I am not as educated as my male white counterpart. So you don't have to say anything. I already know how to do it, and I'm gonna help you out. You're not gonna tell me what you need, you know? Um, that type of, even though the person treated me with respect, that internal let me position myself to tell this person I'm going to do stuff and not let them talk, and I'm not going to listen because they don't know what's going on, is exactly what happens. And that's how that seed grows. That's how that seed grows. If you see a black man on the street, you judge him by the kinkiness of his hair. You might judge him by the size. You might judge him by his stride, how he gapes, how he walks. Maybe he has a little pimp in his step, and that automatically means so many things, right? Maybe it just means he's got a little sore hip, you don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think about this especially in capoeira circles because as far as my experience in capoeira, it's so rare that we have the overt racism, and we have a community that is centered on loving and caring for each other, and like all of our events is like hang out with your friends and have a good time. So I think it would be more difficult. Like it's very easy to imagine that if somebody came into a capoeira event and started throwing racial slurs around, they'd be out the door in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is where it goes to talking about allyship and, actually being there to do the work. There is still a lot of stuff we need to do within our community to challenge that more subtle and implicit racism, especially against Black women. Because when you look at intersectionality, we're not just one thing. We can't categorize people into like woman, disabled, poor, Black. People are many identities, and those identities sometimes layer and create people who are more oppressed, the more marginalized identities that they have. Sometimes they interact in interesting ways. So like, for example, I'm disabled, but I'm also a white woman. So even though I might be oppressed for my disability and, experience discrimination in that way, I don't experience discrimination because I'm white, And so that's been something I think people struggle to understand, is that we still do kind of need to clean our own house in capoeira. Can you speak just in general to some of the ways that anti-Blackness manifests within capoeira, both
Yeah.
structurally or interpersonally? Let's hit both. Let's go.
Let's hit them both. So one of the things that I experienced as both a teacher and a student, let me start out by saying this. As a teacher now of capoeira, I believe and I feel very strongly that I am always going to be a student of capoeira. I believe very strongly that I can always learn, and rank to me doesn't matter. If someone has an experience that they can bring to the table and I can gain from that, I'm going to learn from that person, whether that person is a contramestre, a mestre, professor, or if they're a monitor, yellow belt, green belt, whatever. So my experiences, I feel like, cross both lines as a teacher and a student. In 2013, I took over my school from my previous instructor. And it was a tough job at the beginning because I was still very much a student. I was a yellow belt when I did it. And I'm not saying that, for those people who have, capoeira experience and understand, what that means. I'm not saying that as woe is me, pity on me. A lot of people have to start very young and in leadership in capoeira, and I recognize that. But what I also recognized was, because my previous teacher was male, he was treated a different way than I have been treated, even up to this point where I have grown in that time and have earned the rank and, humbly earned the rank of instructora. I recognize that as a person of color who is also a woman, I have either had to train harder, where some people are like, I kind of need a break, gonna take a couple months off, show up at the batizado, still get the same belt as me, who, every single class, every single demo, that kind of thing. I have definitely experienced from the teaching aspect that I have to constantly validate what I am teaching. I'm explaining this concept to you. So Mestre so-and-so said this. Mestre so-and-so said that. Mestra so-and-so, contra mestra so-and-so. So
Like your
nothing.
personal isn't enough, isn't validating enough.
Exactly. My personal experience, my own ability, my own knowledge, my own experience is not enough that I am challenged. And there's two ways to describe challenge. I am challenged with having to constantly say, hey, what I'm saying to you is valid because it's valid that they said it, not because me and my own merit is enough to validate what I'm teaching and explaining. Um, when I took over the school, a few years into taking over the school, I definitely sought the advice of a lot of people who had this experience with running schools and running schools for a long time, and the ups and downs and the pros and cons. And a teacher in particular, who I tremendously respect, said to me, Sabia, um, as a black woman in this, just hands down, you're gonna have to work 2, 3, 4 times as hard as your counterpart. You're gonna have to train harder. You're gonna have to be at more events. You're gonna have to constantly put more effort, more energy, do more, show more, just to essentially break even and get your recognition.
Yeah, and it
And
sorry, I just wanted to
uh,
say, so what you're talking about right now is often referred to as racial gaslighting. So basically, gaslighting is the idea when you don't have your experiences validated out by people outside of you. So I think that a relatable example is when, like a woman says, "Oh, this coworker is making me uncomfortable. He's being, a little sexual towards me, and it's bothering me." And then, you have the male coworkers who comes in, well, he's just being nice. Have you thought that maybe you're wrong and your experiences are invalid and you don't actually know what it's like to live in your body and experience the I was trying to do a thing and I couldn't do the thing. But
great.
no, it's real. It's so real. It's like, and I experienced this as a disabled person when people be like, do you think if they're really treating you poorly because of your disability, or do they just hate you? And I'm just like,
Mm-hmm.
what? But like that
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting happens all the time. People can Google that term to learn more, where it's just people are viewed outside of the context of their discrimination, like if you it's I'm really happy that somebody was able to just say that to you instead of, because it can translate to a lot of people into, am I not enough? Am I
Mm-hmm.
doing something wrong? Is there
Mm-hmm.
something about my personality that's making people treat me the way that they're treating me? And it's like, no, this isn't even about you. They haven't seen you. They've only seen you. And so I just wanted to like throw that term in there because I think that that's a good education point for a lot of people wanting to learn about this. But please continue.
Actually, I'm really glad that you said that, because this what you touched on is something that probably hasn't been touched on in this yet. Maybe it has, and if it has, it's wonderful. But it's actually, and this might kind of deviate a little bit, it touches on to the mental health load of this experience. This is a very real thing. I mean, imagine having to constantly second and third and fourth guess your existence, constantly wonder if what you said was valid. How did you say it? So why did they respond that way? Did I say the wrong thing? Constantly questioning yourself, you know, just that constant thought process of, okay, this is how I, using capoeira again as the example, this is how I taught the class, and I saw my white male student over there doing a technique in such a way that would not only injure himself but possibly injure someone else around them. So maybe I offered a correction, and then in offering that correction I got a lot of sass, and now I have to, because now I have to take in that sass when I'm thinking, okay, what I'm saying to you is going to, keep you from injuring yourself and possibly other people. I have to internalize that sass because A, I have to finish my class. And B, when I go home, I am, well, what did I say? How did I say it? Was I so rude? Was I so mean? But I remember in this experience, in this circumstance, where maybe my white counterpart teacher saw some other student doing a very similar thing and gave them that same correction in the exact same way. And it was, oh yeah, thank you. And I was, yeah, I don't want to, rip my ankle off or whatever.
That goes so much too. In Capoeira, for better or worse, we do have a little bit of cult of celebrity where we have our mestres that we just venerate. And and rightfully so, they've put in the work. They have dedicated their lives to these.
Mm-hmm.
However, when you have a white passing mestre, a male mestre, and they're giving you some advice, that advice might not apply to you as a woman, especially as a Black woman, because they enter that space in a different way. And so if the information always has, as you referred to earlier with, oh, the mestre said this, mestre said this, mestre said this, having to always bring this information in, there's a lot of information on the ground. We lose a lot of Black women in capoeira in their first year. And I've seen it in so many groups. You have that first chord that's there every day, training all the time, doing all the labor for the events, and she don't even have a chord yet. Like, we see that so often, and there's not, I don't know, do you see any mechanisms by which that experience travels up, or is that like an area for growth in general?
Actually, that's the way you phrase it is actually really good. A, yes, it is an area for growth in general. And B, you're absolutely right. I I had the honor of speaking with a maestra who had said something at an event that I constantly have to repeat to myself, and I think is one of the primary reasons why I'm still in capoeira for as long as I've been in it at this point. And she was addressing a group of women, and what she said was, for all of the bull, for all of the, machismo, for all of the arrogance, for all of the sexism, for all of the things that are in capoeira that are established to keep women down, particularly Black women, and I will address that in a moment, capoeira can't get better if we're not in it. And that is so true. It was absolutely true. If we, and it's a hard sell. That means that we are the ones who have to endure those blows. We're the ones who have to kind of take those punches and carry on. And like I was saying before with that mental health issue, not everybody has to be the stereotypical strong Black woman or strong whatever, But when she said that, and she was so true, I internalized that. And I said, I can't affect any change if I'm not here to affect any change.
Yeah.
It's not going to change unless I'm here to help move that along. To the point that, yes, the attrition rate of Black women in capoeira is staggering, and it's tragic, because I have definitely met a number of Black women who have started out in capoeira, and it just appeals to their soul. It's what they've been looking for. It's the women who like the dance. It's the women who love the music. It's the women who feel connected to their ancestry, their roots. The women who are the martial artists who want to get in there and do the fight. The women who love the aesthetics of it and love the flippy stuff and love, the body movement and all of those things, all across the board. And they come in and they join capoeira. And I can talk to about one woman in particular. I remember just this beautiful young woman who walked into, I was still a student, and she walked into one of the classes that I was in. At the time was being run by a male instructor who, Lord bless his soul, that's all I'm going to say about it. And she was brand new. And I remember the first thing that the instructor said to her, he did some technique that required, several years of experience, and not only several years of experience, some degree of fitness level too. Something that, you shouldn't assume that someone walking in wanting to try this for the first time is just going to be able to bust out and do. And she struggled with it, and that got into her head. Now, this is a person who wanted to try capoeira, And yes, you know, we usually prepare our students, hey, this is going to be physical. You know, for me, it's, you know, everything is about progression. Your muscles have to get stronger over time. You're not supposed to be a mastery in 2 days of doing this. And if you think you are, you probably should train something else. But I could see the wheels turning in her head. Is this really for me? Can I really do this? And I remember she had the courage, because she's in a new environment, she knows no one, she doesn't know the teacher, and she had the courage to ask the teacher, you know, how can I build my way into this particular technique? And the teacher in that moment could have kept her or lost her, and he lost her. He said, you just got to do it, and it doesn't get easier.
Wow, that's so useful and so grounded in fitness technique. I didn't know that if perhaps I just committed to doing it, I could skip the very articulate or the very like particular workouts that it takes to build the body to
Build
be
the body.
able to do that work. It's like a weird type of elitism too. It's like,
It
no,
really is.
your
It
body isn't my body. And like, that's
You know, and so of course she left, and that was it. I knew she was never coming back, um, and it was very unfortunate for white men who tend to like that kind of challenge. Guess what? You know, flock right to it. Stick around for the long haul.
let's go into that for a sec because I think that this is something that's bothered me a lot in dialogue around racism and around how do we create affirming spaces for people,
Mhm.
So when you are a white man, and and this again, people will probably challenge this, but you aren't receiving the same constant wearing down
Mhm.
on your soul that like many other marginalized people, especially Black women, are. So you as a white man, you can go through this world. You can go to the bank and be affirmed. You can go to your job and be affirmed. You can go to your school and be affirmed. There's all of these places of affirmation. Whereas if you are a marginalized person at the bank, they might act like you don't have education, like, and just on and on and on. So when we really think about it, if we're not creating affirming spaces for growth within Capoeira, we're not grading on the same scale, right? Because
Exactly.
somebody that isn't challenged in any way with that kind of like, well, just do it or you suck, is like, that's a very different experience than a Black woman who might be like, yeah, so I got yelled at on the bus, and then I got mistaken for the janitor, and I'm a
Hmm.
doctor. And then I was talked down to by, this person, and then this happened, and then this happened. But I still showed up. I still came to class. And now I'm not good enough here either. Like,
Right.
and and I
Yeah.
think that it's that when we consider that it's just different based
Mhm.
on who you are, what you need in that space. I think we have to be conscious of that when we're cultivating capoeira communities.
I completely agree. I completely agree. Um, it's we have to be, and to your point, even I can even argue this point, which I think is a valid point that needs to be said, is that students who walk into capoeira, we as teachers, it's our responsibility to create a safe space for those students to who walk into capoeira. We have to remind them that, you know, if they truly want to be able to do a thing in capoeira, that they should be able to do it, and not just, yeah, you can do that, just go on and do it.
Yeah,
It's, let me help you get there. Let me show you where to start. Let me teach you what to do, how to do it, how often to do it, when to rest, which I find is not always emphasized very much in capoeira. Hey, guess what? Maybe don't train today. It's actually okay to not train, and, you know, maybe put your feet up and chill out a little bit and rest your body and your mind.
I
And
mean,
I
I
feel
just
like
got
that,
knee surgery and I shouldn't go do flips on concrete.
yeah, you know, something like that. A little bit.
Like,
You know, just little things like that. But, you know, I also feel that, you know, from a teacher's perspective, there is recognizing when a student walks in and they are heavy in the mind. You know, that person that was mistaken for the person who stocks shelves at the grocery store, even though they're the software engineer who just got off from work. or, you know, the person who did walk into the bank to explain their financial situation and was completely dismissed, or the woman who can't even go to a doctor and be heard because of her skin tone and her gender and is dismissed, her pain in her body, whatever is happening, what conditions need to be diagnosed, all of those things. So I feel very much that, because I've experienced it both as a teacher and a student, that the capoeira space needs to be a safe space, a way to say, you know what, here I can I can just be, and no one's going to push me beyond what I want to do. You know, if I'm not there yet, my teacher hopefully has enough insight and recognition to recognize that I'm not there yet. And then there's the flip side of it. And this is actually one that if any of my students actually watch this, which would be awesome, they've heard from me a million times. The teacher is also human.
Yeah.
And that teacher, especially when, you know, my students, they have a teacher who is a woman of color. I have gone through the day at the job where I was supposed to be in the meeting, but I was forgotten about. And now, you know, here's 30,000 things that you need to do that you don't know anything about. Figure it out. Great. If you want to keep your job. I am the woman who has to, you know, make sure that I'm not getting pulled over by a police officer. I am that woman who has to entertain maybe the whims of our space or whatever, you know, maybe our dojo renters, you know, changed a rule and suddenly I'm supposed to know what that is and all that and the other. And I also walk into class with all of these things. I walk down the street and I carry 2 backpacks. And so maybe I look homeless because I'm getting ready to walk into capoeira class with big old sweatpants on and 2 big old backpacks, and I'm shuffling down the street because it's heavy and someone's, you know, assuming that, making assumptions about me. And those assumptions probably have nothing to do with the martial art I'm about to teach. And I also believe it's the responsibility of the students to be mindful of that with the teacher and to recognize that this is a safe space for everyone, including the person who's going to give instruction. Now, if the teacher is going to be mindful enough to make sure that the young African-American woman who just walked in and is feeling unsure and is wondering whether or not she's going to be pressured to represent the entirety of her Blackness through this martial art, and, you know, even the young white man that has just blown right past her and, you know, knocked her in the shoulder, you know, trying to get to the locker room, all of those things, those little things have to be acknowledged and addressed so that the space is safe for everyone in there. Yeah. I think that's something that doesn't always get emphasized, and it goes back to the point that you made about, you know, the cult of celebrity once someone earns rank, you know, and I can't say that I don't have an ego, I'd be lying, but I try to be very mindful of who I am and where I am in space, and make sure that my ego stays in check when it needs to be in check. And frankly, sometimes when I need to step out of my, okay, I'm tired of hearing the same person, you know, say, well, that wasn't right because Mr. So-and-so called it this, the same person over and over again, I probably need to step out of my patient little box and maybe have to tell someone, look, the reason why you are treating me this way is because of your own implicit internal bias. You don't like that you're hearing this from a person who looks like me, and perhaps had the same exact information come out of a person's mouth that doesn't look like me, maybe a male, maybe a white counterpart, you would probably shut up. And I have had to say that.
And I am grateful that you have. I wish I could have been there. You know, this is a complete like thought that just popped into my head. So if it doesn't make sense, it's because I didn't like think about this before the second. But when I think about like classic martial art trope movies, right? And like, how many movies do we have where the first 30 minutes of the movie is actually the deconstruction of the male ego, or like the white male ego of the guy who like was super confident and he went to this like training place in vaguely Asia, because we know how these movies kind of are. And, you know, the first 30 minutes of the movie is like breaking down his ego until he's in a place of humility where he can learn, you know? And I think that that's kind of a weird like trope that gets enacted in a lot of martial arts spaces. Like, I'm gonna break you down so I can build you up. And it's like, okay, well, perhaps not everyone needs, you know, their ego to be broken down. Perhaps people are coming to this space for other things, and they should be validated in what they come to this space for. Part of the beauty of capoeira is that capoeira is for every type of body and every type of person. You know, like, if you can't flip, you can do music. If you sing terribly, you can learn the history and help promote that. You know, you can help with the kids class and do classroom management if you can't teach. Like, you can do all of these things in capoeira. And I think that, like, a greater consciousness of how do we support the different types of people that come to capoeira, maybe we can work on the attrition issues. And speaking of the attrition issues, and also of the fact that we are running out of time, I wanted to end kind of on something hopeful. We have a lot of people who are really conscious of how they show up in space for the first time, thinking about being allies. When we are trying to be allies within capoeira spaces, like, what does that look like? The one that immediately comes to mind is, like, if you see these microaggressions happening, stop them. Say something.
Say something.
You know, but is there other ways that, like, come to your mind of how we can kind of push back against this culture that pushes Black women out?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One is, you know, like we said before, is making sure that we create a welcoming environment. One of the things that I have experienced is that, let's say we're in a capoeira school and everybody knows each other and everybody knows that's the one person over there that's going to be the ass. Let's just, you know, what I think makes for a very healthy, safe space is not always waiting on the instructor to put the ass in their place, but the community recognizing, hey, what you just said, and you know, there's no need to be rude or mean or cruel, but to call that person out and say, this is a safe space. The way that you're conducting yourself is not acceptable, and it's not tolerated, and you need to find ways to grow. When a person walks into a space, particularly a Black woman who is wearing, I don't like to generalize, but I'm going to generalize this one. I can't imagine Black women who exist who have not at some point in their lives felt the weight of having to represent their race and their gender at some point in their lives. And if that person walks into your space, you don't have to treat them like the gender and the race that they are walking in as. You treat them first like a human being. You know, you don't make any assumptions about them. You don't make any assumptions about their financial status. You don't make any assumptions about, you know, what their relationship statuses are, or any of the things that typically we get labeled as Black women. We know no assumptions about whether or not they're strong and tough and hardy and this, that, and the other. You know, none of those assumptions. You let them walk in and you let them present themselves to you. Yeah. And you allow that presentation and you take it for face value until they present some way differently. And then you bring them into that space and you show them that if someone who doesn't look like them steps out of line, that person is not just dismissed because they're a guy or because their skin is lighter, that action is acknowledged and called out. And then you do that actually for anyone who steps out of line. Mm-hmm. Or you make sure that everyone is in the mindset of not stepping out of line, but being supportive of each other. One of the things I do, particularly in my class, and I'm sure other people do this too, this isn't special, but it does, I think it helps. When there's time and when we're not pressed for all the other little details that we usually have to do in our space, when class is over and everyone's tired and we're training and we're and sweaty and stinky, we sit down and I try to go around. We make a little harder sitting down, and I try to go around and I say, you know, what's something that you got out of class today? What was something that was positive for you? What was a good learning experience that happened for you? And we have students who sometimes have trouble sharing what's on their mind. But once you've trained and you're tired and your body just wants to sit, you know, there's something about that mental release that allows for that sharing. And what tends to happen is as people share, I usually try to keep it to a couple of minutes, but as people go around and share, people make connections. Oh yeah, that happened with me too. Yeah, you're right. I felt that way too. Yeah. And that brings people together. And suddenly I feel like we see each other as humanity and not as race and gender.
Yeah. I think it's funny. So when you started answering the question, the light like shifted and just like started illuminating behind you. And I loved that. And I loved your answer. And I'm just really freaking grateful that you took the time out to do this. I'm really excited to put this out and for people to see it. If people want to stay up to date with you and with your work, how can they do that? What is the best way to like support you or your group or your events, whatever?
Thank you for mentioning that and giving me the opportunity. I am on Facebook. Our school is Capoeira Mandinga Detroit. Also, you can find us on Instagram. We do have an old Twitter account hanging around. Everything will either be under Capoeira Mandinga Detroit or under Mandinga Detroit. We are tentatively, because you know COVID is still a thing right now, looking towards having a small event at the first weekend in October. Should that happen, there will be information that'll be coming out probably around August regarding that. Again, that's all tentative. We want to keep everybody healthy and safe. In the meantime, if anyone wants to check us out, you know, our website is www.capoeiradetroit.org, and they can see more about what we do, who we are. One of the things I have to say that I'm extraordinarily proud of with my school and my students is we are an incredibly diverse student group. We do have Black women that have stuck around for years. We've got just about every race and gender that's passed through our group, including we're LGBTQIA friendly, all the things. If you are a human being, you are welcome, but you have to act with humanity. That's the only reason why you would ever be asked to leave. So come check us out.
All right. And if you want to support this series, if you are watching this and you're like, Asma, I really want to talk about, get at me. Please send me a message on Facebook. Let me know. We are also going to start a GoFundMe to try to keep doing more of these. So all of the instructors in the series are paid, even though some of them don't necessarily want to let me pay them. But anyway, so we do want to pay people for their labor for participating in this. So if you are able to contribute, please do so we can keep this going. And if you would like to collaborate in another way, if you see this style and you're like, that's something that I can do, please get at me as well, because we have a YouTube channel that we've just started up with some help from some folks in Seattle. And I would love to add other people's work to it and just kind of create a central repository for the work that we are documenting now. COVID sucks, but we are also in a place where we are actually documenting things in ways that we didn't before. And we don't want to lose this when this is over. So that's it. Savia, thank you so much.
You are so welcome. I'm so in gratitude to you for this.
Hey, all right. Bye, guys.